Level 1. Saturn devouring his son. The painting shows a scene that feels more like a nightmare than a myth. In the dimness, a figure with wide eyes and tense muscles holds what remains of a human body. There is no background, no time, no witnesses, only the act itself. The viewer is forced to confront it directly, without escape. The brushstrokes are rough, the colors are thick, and everything seems to move in slow, silent horror. The author is Francisco de Goya, a Spanish painter who lived between 1746 and 1828. By the time he created this work, he was old, sick, and almost completely deaf. He had once been a respected court artist, but his later years were marked by isolation and disillusionment. Saturn devouring his son was not a commission, nor was it meant to be seen by the public. Goya painted it on the wall of his own home, in solitude. The context of the painting is the period after years of political violence and personal suffering. Spain was in turmoil, and Goya had witnessed executions, war, and censorship. He bought a small house outside Madrid, and there he covered the walls with disturbing images, what would later be called the Black Paintings. Saturn was one of them, hidden inside his dining room. The symbolism reaches beyond the myth of the god who devours his children. Some historians see in it a reflection of power destroying itself, or an aging artist terrified by the passage of time. Others think Saturn represents humankind's most primitive instincts, the dark side that reason cannot control. There is no glory, no beauty, only the raw truth of fear and survival. An interesting fact is that Goya never titled these works himself. The names we use today were added decades later when the murals were transferred from the plaster walls to canvas after his death. The pigments, mixed with everyday paint, aged unevenly and gave the piece its rough, almost decaying texture. It was never designed to last, yet it endures. In conclusion, Saturn devouring his son is not just a mythological image, but a psychological document. It shows what happens when the boundaries between power, fear, and madness disappear. The scene is ancient, but the emotion is human, timeless, direct, and impossible to forget. Works of Zdzisław Beksiński. Across his canvases stretch worlds that feel both ancient and futuristic, vast wastelands filled with ruins, skeletal towers, and figures that seem carved from bone and fog. The atmosphere is silent, without horizon or time. His paintings do not tell stories. They exist like fragments of a forgotten civilization, frozen between dream and decay. Even when no movement is shown, everything seems to tremble, as if the air itself were alive with memory. Zdzisław Beksiński was born in 1929 in Sanok, Poland. Trained as an architect, he abandoned the profession to devote himself to painting, drawing, and photography. He worked largely in isolation, rarely giving titles to his works or explaining their meaning. His technical precision came from architectural discipline, but his imagination reached into the irrational, a personal mythology shaped by history, faith, and the subconscious. Beksiński witnessed the devastation of war in his youth, and though he never depicted it directly, its shadows remained throughout his art. The context of his career is complex. In the 1960s and 70s, while much of Europe turned toward abstraction and minimalism, Beksiński developed a private, figurative language. His early fantastic period was defined by intricate landscapes filled with humanoid forms, decaying cathedrals, and infinite plains under crimson skies. Later, in the 1980s and 90s, his palette lightened and his compositions grew simpler, figures dissolving into geometry and light. Throughout his life, he avoided public interpretation, insisting that art should speak through emotion rather than words. Symbolically, his works are often seen as meditations on transformation. The human body appears fused with architecture, roots, or machinery, suggesting the merging of flesh and structure. Faces blur into masks, and buildings resemble living organisms. Critics have read his imagery as reflections on mortality, memory, and the fragile boundary between creation and ruin. Yet Beksiński himself rejected such analysis, saying that he painted what came to him in visions, scenes that were neither dreams nor nightmares, but photographs of another world. An interesting fact, despite the darkness of his paintings, Beksiński was known personally as gentle and ironic, often describing his work as optimistic rather than tragic. He rarely left his studio and worked daily, often using classical music as background. In 2001, his studio was preserved as part of the Historical Museum in Sanok, where hundreds of his paintings, photographs, and sketches are now displayed. His entire archive was meticulously organized, reflecting a mind deeply methodical even in chaos. Seen as a whole, Beksiński's work forms a visual language of silence. It neither warns nor explains. It simply shows the architecture of fear, beauty, and decay that exists beyond words. His worlds do not depict the end. They depict what comes after, when time has stopped and memory continues to build. Each painting stands as a quiet monument to imagination unbound, a vision of what remains when everything else has faded. The Scream. A lonely figure stands on a bridge, its mouth frozen in a soundless cry. The landscape around it twists and vibrates as if trembling under invisible pressure. Red clouds swirl above the fjord, while two distant figures walk away, unaware. Space itself seems unstable, a world collapsing under the weight of emotion. Edvard Munch, born in Norway in 1863, created this image in 1893. His art often turned private feelings into visible forms. Long before psychology became part of popular thought, trained in realism, he abandoned precision for intensity, using shape and color to describe what cannot be explained with words. The story behind the painting comes from Munch's own diary. He once wrote about walking at sunset when the sky suddenly turned red, and he felt the great scream of nature. The sensation of panic and emptiness stayed with him, later becoming the scene we now recognize as the Scream. The figure's form is both human and not. Reduced to a symbol of emotion itself, the blood-red sky could suggest fire, sunset, or the turmoil of the mind. The bridge separates stillness from chaos, order from collapse. For many viewers, it captures the exact instant when control breaks and fear becomes a physical force. A curious fact: scientists believe Munch may have seen the strange red sunsets caused by the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, whose volcanic dust circled the Earth and colored European skies for years. A real atmospheric phenomenon may have helped shape one of art's most psychological visions. Silent yet overwhelming, The Scream remains one of the purest expressions of inner crisis. It does not show danger, only the invisible pressure of existence, the soundless echo that every human being can recognize. The Nightmare. A woman lies sprawled across a bed, her body limp, her head hanging back as if she has fallen into an uneasy sleep. On her chest crouches a small dark creature with round eyes and heavy limbs, while from behind the curtain, the pale head of a horse peers out, its eyes wide and hollow. The air is still, but the scene feels alive, as though the dream itself has entered the room. Henry Fuseli, a Swiss-born artist who spent most of his life in London, painted this work in 1781. Educated first as a theologian, he later turned to art, fascinated by mythology, dreams, and the darker corners of imagination. Unlike the calm order of the Enlightenment, Fuseli's vision celebrated what could not be reasoned: emotion, fantasy, and the subconscious. The image emerged at a time when the idea of the nightmare was being linked to both folklore and early psychology. In older beliefs, a nightmare was a spirit or demon pressing on a sleeper's chest, stealing breath and peace. Fuseli visualized that myth literally, combining sensuality, fear, and mystery in a single image that felt both intimate and supernatural. The painting's meaning has been interpreted in many ways. Some view it as an allegory of repressed emotion, a collision of desire and dread. Others see it as a reflection of Fuseli's personal turmoil, an unreturned affection that found form in dream imagery. The bright fabric, the shadowed room, and the watching horse together suggest the thin boundary between consciousness and the unknown. An unusual fact is that The Nightmare became one of the first paintings to achieve mass popularity through prints. Reproductions spread across Europe and America, influencing literature, theater, and later cinema. The word nightmare itself began to take on its modern psychological meaning partly through the image's fame. The nightmare remains a bridge between myth and psychology. It shows not a monster from outside, but the shadow that rises from within the human mind, the place where fear, imagination, and desire meet in the dark. Guernica. At first glance, the painting seems chaotic, a storm of broken forms, faces, and limbs. Horses scream, a mother lifts her child, a man lies dismembered on the ground. The entire scene unfolds in a palette of black, white, and gray, as if drained of all warmth. Triangular beams of light cut through the darkness, yet nothing is illuminated. It feels like a frozen explosion, an instant stretched into eternity. Pablo Picasso created Guernica in 1937, at the height of his fame and during one of Europe's darkest decades. Born in Malaga, Spain, in 1881, Picasso had already transformed modern art through Cubism, but this work marked a turning point, a shift from formal innovation to moral urgency. He painted it in his Paris studio, commissioned by the Spanish Republic for the International Exposition in Paris. What began as a request for a simple mural became one of the most powerful visual statements of the 20th century. The painting's origin lies in a real event. On April 26, 1937, the Basque town of Guernica was attacked from the air, leaving much of it in ruins. Reports and photographs reached Picasso, who until then had remained distant from political commentary. The destruction struck him deeply. Within weeks, he filled his notebooks with sketches of distorted figures and animals, not literal representations, but emotional equivalents of what he imagined the scene to be. The finished mural measured over 7 meters wide, its monumental scale amplifying the sense of shock. Every shape in Guernica carries symbolic tension. The horse at the center, pierced and screaming, has been read as the suffering of the innocent. The bull, calm but menacing, may represent blind brutality or enduring strength. The weeping woman holding her lifeless child echoes ancient depictions of mourning. The fractured light bulb above could be both an eye and an artificial sun, illumination that exposes but does not heal. Picasso never confirmed any interpretation, preferring ambiguity. The image works not as narrative, but as a universal language of pain and collapse. One of the most revealing details is Picasso's deliberate use of monochrome. The absence of color strips away distraction, leaving only form and contrast. It recalls black and white photography and printed news, the primary way people of the time saw distant destruction. The texture of the paint, rough and uneven, enhances the impression of immediacy, as if the image were carved out of ash. An intriguing historical fact: Guernica traveled widely after its creation, becoming a silent ambassador against violence. During Picasso's lifetime, he refused to allow the painting to return to Spain until the country restored democracy. For decades, it was housed in New York's Museum of Modern Art, returning only in 1981. Even today, it remains heavily guarded in Madrid's Museo Reina Sofia, a relic not just of art history, but of collective memory. Viewed today, Guernica feels less like a political statement and more like a mirror. It does not depict a specific event as much as the collapse of human order itself, the scream of beings caught between light and void. Its fragmented geometry invites the viewer to reconstruct meaning from ruin. In that process, Picasso's mural continues to speak, not in words, not even in time, but in the silent pulse of horror that art can translate into form. The Raft of the Medusa. A vast, stormy sea fills the canvas. At its center, a fragile wooden raft rises and falls among dark waves. Dozens of figures cling to it, some waving toward a distant ship, others lying motionless. The sky opens in two halves, one of hope, faint and golden, the other black and heavy. The moment captured is suspended between rescue and oblivion. Théodore Géricault painted this monumental work between 1818 and 1819, when he was only 27. Born in Rouen, France, he studied classical painting, but rejected its calm ideals. Instead, he pursued emotion, anatomy, and the raw truth of the human body. The Raft of the Medusa was his first major masterpiece, created not by commission, but out of personal obsession. It marked the early rise of Romanticism, the movement that replaced harmony with drama, order with human struggle. The painting was based on a real maritime disaster. In 1816, the French frigate Medusa ran aground off the coast of Africa. The ship's officers abandoned most passengers, leaving 147 men on a hastily built raft with no navigation or supplies. For 13 days, they drifted under the sun and storms. Only 15 survived when rescue finally arrived. When the event became public, it caused national outrage, symbolizing government failure and human cruelty. Géricault investigated the event with the precision of a reporter. He interviewed survivors, studied corpses in hospitals, and built a scale model of the raft in his studio. He spent months sketching twisted bodies and decaying skin, determined to portray reality without theatrical heroism. The figures in the final composition form a human pyramid, from despair at the bottom to a fragile spark of hope at the top, where one man waves a piece of cloth toward the horizon. Yet the rescue ship is barely visible, suggesting that salvation remains uncertain. Symbolically, the painting transcends the historical event. It became an image of society adrift, where survival depends on chance and strength of will. The sea, endless and indifferent, represents both nature's power and humanity's vulnerability. The raft, built from fragments of the ship, mirrors civilization itself, unstable, temporary, and held together by desperation. An interesting fact: when the Raft of the Medusa was exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1819, it caused a scandal. Critics were disturbed by its realism and by the absence of noble heroes. Géricault's decision to show anonymous suffering rather than victory broke artistic convention. Over time, however, the painting came to be seen as a turning point. the birth of modern history painting, where emotion replaced idealization. Today, the Raft of the Medusa dominates an entire wall in the Louvre. Its scale, over 7 meters wide, forces the viewer to stand before it as if before a real event. 2 centuries later, it remains a powerful study of endurance, despair, and the thin line separating hope from silence. The face of war. A massive head floats in a desolate desert. Its skin appears cracked and lifeless, its eyes and mouth filled with smaller skulls that repeat endlessly, skulls within skulls echoing into infinity. Around it, snakes coil and twist, their bodies blending into the sand. The landscape is empty, pale and timeless, as if the world has stopped breathing. There is no movement, only the stillness of aftermath. Salvador Dalí painted The Face of War in 1940 during his stay in the United States after fleeing Europe. Born in Spain in 1904, Dalí was already known as one of the leading figures of Surrealism, an art movement that sought to explore the unconscious through dreamlike imagery. Yet this work marked a change. Instead of his usual playfulness and illusion, Dalí created something stark, stripped of irony and deeply human. The context was global chaos. Dalí had witnessed the Spanish civil conflict and the beginning of a new worldwide catastrophe. The painting was made shortly after he left Europe, carrying with him the memories of destruction. Although not depicting a specific event, The Face of War reflects the universal terror that spreads after every conflict, the silence that follows when everything familiar collapses. In its symbolism, the painting functions like a visual echo of trauma. The repeated skulls suggest an endless cycle, suffering that reproduces itself generation after generation. The snakes, traditional emblems of fear and rebirth, crawl through the image as if consuming what remains of life. The desert background emphasizes isolation. No city, no human trace, only emptiness. Even the light feels unnatural, caught between day and night. A curious fact is that Dalí left a small self-portrait hidden within the eye socket of one of the skulls, a signature almost invisible to the naked eye. He often inserted himself symbolically into his works, but here the gesture seems different. Not pride, but a statement that no one escapes the shadow of history. The painting was later acquired by the Museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam, where it remains today. The Face of War stands as one of Dalí's most direct and haunting visions. It abandons the surreal games of illusion to confront the raw structure of fear itself. The skulls, multiplied without end, suggest that violence leaves not scars, but reflections, infinite, repeating, and silent. Judith beheading Holofernes. In the center of the scene, 2 women lean over a man pinned to a bed. One holds him down with firm, steady arms, while the other, her face calm and focused, raises a sword mid-strike. The light falls sharply on their faces and the white sheets, while the background disappears into darkness. The composition is tense, physical, and precise. Every detail, from the grip on the weapon to the folds of fabric, pulls the viewer into the moment when strength meets resolve. Artemisia Gentileschi painted this work around 1612 to 1613 during her early years in Rome. She was the daughter of painter Orazio Gentileschi and grew up in his studio, where she learned the techniques of Caravaggio, the master of shadow and light. Unlike most women of her time, Artemisia pursued painting professionally, facing obstacles and prejudices in a male-dominated art world. Her version of Judith beheading Holofernes became one of her most recognized works, rivaling those of her male contemporaries in both skill and intensity. The story comes from the Book of Judith, an ancient biblical text. Judith, a widow from the besieged city of Bethulia, gains the trust of the Assyrian general Holofernes. When he falls asleep in his tent, she seizes the chance to kill him, saving her people. Artists had painted this scene for centuries, but Artemisia's version departs from the idealized portrayals common before her time. Her Judith does not act with detachment or hesitation. She moves with purpose, her body engaged in real struggle. The violence is not theatrical, but human and deliberate. Symbolically, the painting embodies power, justice, and reversal. The 2 women, Judith and her maidservant, represent intelligence and determination working together. The contrast between their illuminated faces and the surrounding shadow suggests moral clarity emerging from chaos. Many scholars have seen personal meaning in the work, connecting it to Artemisia's own experience of hardship and her fight for artistic independence. Whether or not that interpretation is accurate, the painting carries an undeniable energy of defiance and control. An interesting fact, Gentileschi returned to this subject more than once, painting a second version years later in Florence. The 2 works differ subtly, the later one heavier, darker, and even more exact in its anatomy. Modern analysis has shown that Artemisia likely used real models and studied the human form directly, something rare for a woman artist of her era. Her technical precision, the muscles, the light on the blade, reveals a deep understanding of both realism and emotion. Today, Judith beheading Holofernes stands as one of the defining images of Baroque art. Beyond its dramatic surface, it captures a timeless idea, the moment when courage transforms fear into action. In the interplay of light and shadow, Artemisia Gentileschi gave form to a truth that transcends its story, that determination, once awakened, can be as sharp and unstoppable as the sword itself. Big electric chair. A single object dominates the image, a wooden chair placed in an empty room. The space is silent, the air still. On the wall behind, faint signs and shadows hint at institutional order, yet everything feels abandoned. The colors are unnatural, bright pinks, cold blues, or faded gray, depending on the version. Nothing moves, but the stillness carries tension, as if the object holds a memory of something irreversible. Andy Warhol created Big Electric Chair in 1967 using a photograph taken at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York during the 1950s. The image was part of his Death and Disaster series, in which he transformed press photos of accidents, suicides, and executions into repeated silk-screened images. Born in Pittsburgh in 1928, Warhol had already become a central figure of pop art, a movement that explored mass culture, advertising, and the power of repetition. Yet this work revealed another side of his art, the quiet unease beneath the surface of modern life. The cultural background of Big Electric Chair is tied to a period of debate about justice, punishment, and spectacle in mid-20th century America. The electric chair, once presented as a symbol of technological progress, had come to represent institutional violence and moral ambiguity. Warhol's decision to isolate the object, removing any human presence, strips it of narrative and leaves only form, a design of power. By doing so, he transforms a functional device into a portrait of absence. Symbolically, the work explores the distance between image and event. The chair becomes both real and unreal, a photographic trace that repeats endlessly, losing emotion with every copy. This repetition, central to Warhol's technique, questions how society grows numb to what it sees. The bright colors, almost cheerful, contrast with the subject's gravity, creating a tension between surface beauty and silent horror. An interesting fact is that Warhol used several color variations of the same print, experimenting with combinations that altered the mood completely. Some versions glow like pop posters, others fade into monochrome decay. He described this process as removing the hand of the artist, letting the machine, the silkscreen, decide what remains imperfect. The method echoed his idea that modern emotion is filtered through technology and repetition. Seen today, Big Electric Chair is not just a commentary on punishment, but on perception itself. It captures the modern condition of looking, the way images of tragedy can become patterns, decorations, or icons. Warhol does not moralize or explain, he simply shows the emptiness left behind when meaning fades. The result is an image both ordinary and unbearable. A quiet room, a single chair, and the echo of something that can no longer be seen but cannot be forgotten. The Temptation of St. Anthony. The scene unfolds like a dream that has forgotten logic. A landscape stretches in fragments, burning cities, floating ships, hybrid creatures that merge human, animal, and machine. At the center, a small, calm figure kneels in prayer, Saint Anthony, surrounded by a world collapsing into delirium. Around him, monsters fly, mock, and tempt, each one detailed with impossible precision. The sky is neither day nor night, the horizon filled with smoke and movement. Every corner of the painting seems alive with noise and meaning. Hieronymus Bosch, born in the Netherlands around 1450, created this triptych in the early 16th century at the height of the Northern Renaissance. Unlike his contemporaries who painted saints and kings in orderly worlds, Bosch filled his canvases with chaos, symbols of sin, fear, and transformation. He lived in a society obsessed with moral reform and visions of the afterlife, and his art captured that tension between devotion and temptation. The Temptation of St. Anthony is one of his largest and most complex works, now housed in the Museu Nacional de Arte Antiga in Lisbon. The painting illustrates the legend of Anthony the Great, a hermit who withdrew into the desert to live a life of prayer. According to early Christian writings, he was tormented by demons who appeared in countless forms, testing his faith through fear, desire, and illusion. Bosch transformed this story into a visual encyclopedia of human weakness. The temptations take physical form: half-human animals, decaying towers, living instruments, and strange machines. Each figure seems symbolic, greed, pride, or lust made visible. The deeper meaning of Bosch's vision has long been debated. Some interpret the triptych as a warning against corruption in the church. Others see it as a psychological map of temptation, a portrayal of how the mind itself becomes haunted. The calmness of St. Anthony in the center provides the only point of balance. While everything around him burns or mutates, he remains still, suggesting endurance through inner faith. Bosch does not glorify virtue nor condemn vice. He observes them both as inseparable forces in the human condition. A fascinating detail lies in Bosch's early use of surreal imagery. Centuries before the word surreal existed, his monsters combine mechanical and organic parts, predicting the dream logic later explored by modern artists like Dalí and Max Ernst. Infrared studies of the painting reveal that Bosch made constant changes as he worked, adding, erasing, and reshaping creatures as if he were painting thoughts rather than scenes. In the end, the Temptation of St. Anthony stands not only as a religious image, but as a study of endurance within chaos. It is both medieval and timeless, a vision of the mind under pressure, surrounded by the endless parade of its own inventions. Bosch's world is strange, but not distant. It reflects the same struggle that continues in silence inside every human being, the battle between faith, fear, and imagination. The death of Marat. A man lies lifeless in a bathtub, his head gently tilted, his arm hanging over the edge. In one hand he still holds a quill, in the other a folded letter. The surface is sparse, a plain wooden box, a knife, a cloth, and the soft light that touches his face. There are no crowds, no drama, only silence. The stillness transforms the scene into something both intimate and monumental. Jacques-Louis David painted the death of Marat in 1793, during one of the most turbulent periods in French history. Born in Paris in 1748, David was the leading painter of the neoclassical movement, known for his discipline, symmetry, and moral clarity. He was also deeply involved in the events of his time, serving as a supporter of the French Revolution. When the revolutionary writer Jean-Paul Marat was killed in his bath by Charlotte Corday, David, his close friend and political ally, decided to immortalize him in paint. The historical context is inseparable from the image. Marat was a radical journalist and a powerful voice during the revolution, admired by some and feared by others. His chronic skin illness forced him to work from a medicinal bath, where he spent long hours writing political letters. On July 13, 1793, Corday gained access to his home, presenting a petition before attacking him. David visited the scene soon after and painted the aftermath not as a crime, but as a form of sacrifice, a secular martyrdom for the new republic. Symbolically, the painting blurs the line between realism and idealization. Marat's lifeless body resembles classical sculpture, serene, composed, uncorrupted. The bathtub becomes an altar, the wooden box, a tomb. The blood is minimal, carefully controlled. David removes all chaos, transforming the political murder into an image of purity and devotion. The single letter in Marat's hand, supposedly from his killer, acts as both weapon and relic. The result is not only a record of death, but a transformation of it into political iconography. An interesting fact, David deliberately used Christian visual traditions to elevate Marat's image. The composition echoes depictions of Christ's descent from the cross, replacing divine suffering with revolutionary virtue. For decades, the painting served as a symbol of moral integrity and sacrifice. Later generations, however, reinterpreted it as a meditation on propaganda, how art can sanctify power and reshape memory. Today, the death of Marat stands as one of the clearest examples of political art in Western history. It is at once personal and ideological, tender and calculated. The quiet light, the emptiness of the setting, and the still hand holding the pen turn a violent act into a scene of reflection. In David's composition, death becomes not an end, but a message, a moment where history and devotion briefly share the same frame. Massacre of the Innocents. The canvas bursts with movement and anguish. Men, women, and children collide in a whirl of motion, every gesture captured in a moment of desperate resistance. Bodies twist and strain, faces turn upward in silent cries, and light falls across flesh and fabric in violent contrast. There is no single focus. Every part of the painting pulls the eye in another direction, as if chaos itself were alive. Peter Paul Rubens painted Massacre of the Innocents around 1611, shortly after returning to his native Antwerp from Italy. Born in 1577, Rubens was one of the central figures of the Baroque era, admired for his dramatic compositions, vivid color, and mastery of anatomy. He had studied the art of Caravaggio and the sculpture of ancient Rome, fusing them into a new visual language, one driven by emotion, movement, and physical power. This work marked his attempt to capture not calm beauty, but raw intensity. The painting is based on a biblical episode described in the Gospel of Matthew, the order given by King Herod to eliminate all male infants in Bethlehem. Artists had depicted the story before, often as moral scenes of grief. Rubens, however, presented it as immediate reality. He brought the event out of religious distance and into human scale. The figures are contemporary, dressed in 17th century garments, their bodies rendered with precise, almost sculptural detail. There is no symbolic distance, only the direct physical clash of survival. On a deeper level, the painting reflects the world in which Rubens lived. The Low Countries were suffering from years of political conflict and occupation. The chaos of the scene could easily be read as an allegory of his own time, a reflection of human cruelty and loss repeated across history. The muscular forms, drawn from classical art, emphasize not heroism, but futility, strength used to destroy, not to protect. Light cuts across the composition like a weapon, revealing horror without giving peace. An interesting fact is that for centuries, Massacre of the Innocents was misattributed to another artist, Jan van den Hoeke, one of Rubens's followers. It was only in 2001, after a detailed study of brushwork and pigment, that experts confirmed it as an authentic Rubens. Soon after, the painting was sold at auction for a record sum, becoming one of the most valuable works by an old master ever sold. Viewed today, Massacre of the Innocents remains a visual storm, not a moment of narrative, but of human instinct and collapse. Rubens does not ask for pity or judgment. He shows movement, fear, and force without pause, transforming legend into a universal image of helplessness. Within the painting's turmoil, beauty and horror coexist, proof that art can contain both truth and chaos in a single instant of frozen motion. Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan. The scene takes place in a dimly lit room. A man kneels on the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. In his arms lies a young man, his head resting against his father's chest, his face pale and still. The father's hands are stained, his expression frozen between despair and recognition. The red fabric beneath them glows like a wound, while the surrounding darkness swallows the rest of the space. Silence replaces sound, the kind that follows an irreversible act. Ilya Repin completed this painting in 1885 after years of research and hesitation. Born in 1844 in the Russian Empire, Repin was known for his realistic depictions of psychological tension and historical drama. He sought not only to paint events, but to expose the emotional truth within them. In this work, he turned to one of the most infamous legends of Russian history, the moment when Tsar Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, fatally struck his own son during a quarrel. Whether the story happened exactly as told remains uncertain, but for Repin, the myth carried enough weight to reveal a larger truth about power and remorse. The context of the painting reflects both historical fascination and moral anxiety. In the late 19th century, Russia was undergoing social and political turmoil, and the figure of Ivan symbolized the destructive side of authority, a ruler consumed by suspicion and rage. Repin's image, though based on the past, resonated deeply with his own era, when questions of leadership and violence were still unresolved. By depicting not the act itself but its aftermath, he shifted focus from brutality to realization, the instant when emotion overcomes control. Symbolically, the work unites two extremes, power and helplessness. The Tsar, once feared, appears broken and human, his face contorted in grief. The sun's stillness embodies both innocence and consequence. The red tones that dominate the scene suggest blood, guilt, and the weight of conscience. The tight composition draws the viewer into the private collapse of a man who ruled through fear, yet finds himself powerless before what he has done. A notable fact is that the painting caused public outrage when first exhibited. Some saw it as an insult to Russian monarchy, others were disturbed by its emotional intensity. It was even attacked with a knife in 1913 by a visitor who declared it offensive. Repin later repaired the damage himself, preserving the original brushwork and tone. Despite controversy, the painting became one of the defining images of Russian realism, not for its historical accuracy, but for its psychological depth. Ivan the Terrible and his son, Ivan remains one of Repin's most haunting creations. It is a study of human breakdown, the point where power, violence, and regret converge. The scene does not accuse or justify, it simply records the silence after destruction. In that stillness, Repin captured something beyond politics or history, the moment when realization becomes heavier than any crown. The Flaying of Marsyas. The painting shows a forest clearing filled with restrained chaos. A satyr, Marsyas, is suspended upside down from a tree, his body bound while several figures gather around him. One bends with concentration, another watches with detached calm, a third plays a small instrument nearby. The colors are deep and warm, red, gold, and earth, yet the atmosphere feels cold, deliberate, and timeless. The scene is not loud, it is almost quiet, as if nature itself holds its breath. Titian, born Tiziano Vecellio around 1488 in Pieve di Cadore, was already in his late years when he created the Flaying of Marsyas between 1570 and 1576. By that time, he was one of the most respected painters in Europe, known for his mastery of color and human emotion. In his final works, Titian abandoned the polished surface of his earlier style for something looser, darker, and more introspective. This painting, made in the last years of his life, feels less like a myth and more like a meditation, an old man confronting mortality and meaning through mythological form. The story comes from ancient legend. Marsyas, a satyr skilled in music, challenged the god Apollo to a contest, believing he could equal divine art. When he lost, Apollo ordered him to be flayed alive. In classical tradition, the myth symbolized the boundary between human ambition and divine perfection, the punishment for challenging what lies beyond one's limits. Titian's version, however, transforms the event from moral lesson to reflection on existence itself. There is no triumph or punishment in the painting, only process, inevitability, and quiet observation. The symbolism extends beyond the myth. Art historians have noted that Titian may have seen in Marsyas a reflection of himself, the artist exposed before time and truth. The contrast between Apollo's serenity and Marsyas's helplessness becomes an allegory of creation, inspiration and suffering as inseparable forces. The painting's texture reinforces this duality. The brushstrokes are loose, nearly abstract, dissolving form into light. The figures emerge and fade, as if the image were being consumed by its own color. A striking detail is the inclusion of a dog licking the ground near Marsyas's head, a small, almost unnoticed presence that grounds the scene in everyday life. Nearby, a man often identified as the philosopher King Midas, whom Titian gave his own features, watches in silence. This self-reference suggests a final act of introspection, the artist placing himself as witness, not participant, before the mystery of creation and loss. The Flaying of Marsyas stands among Titian's last works, and many believe it was left unfinished at his death. It represents the end of a lifelong search for truth through paint. The myth becomes universal, a vision of suffering not as cruelty, but as revelation, the unveiling of what lies beneath the surface. In the trembling brushwork and fading light, Titian leaves a final message, that beauty and pain, art and mortality are bound by the same act of exposure. Girl with death mask, she plays alone. A small girl stands in the center of an open field. The horizon stretches behind her, a low line of pale blue mountains under a cloudy sky. The land is barren, the air still. She wears a short pink dress and holds a small yellow flower tightly in her hands. Her bare feet rest on dry earth. Covering her face is a white skull mask, smooth and emotionless, with black hollows for eyes and faint cracks drawn across the surface. At her feet lies another mask, rough, gray, animal-like, with a gaping mouth, red tongue, and sharp teeth. Frida Kahlo painted Girl with Death Mask, She Plays Alone in 1938, at a moment of deep reflection in her life and art. Born in Coyoacán, Mexico, in 1907, Kahlo had endured years of illness and physical pain after a bus accident, yet her art grew increasingly confident and symbolic. The late 1930s marked her emergence as an international figure, exhibiting in New York and Paris. But her work remained intensely personal and rooted in Mexican identity. This small painting, made on tin rather than canvas, belongs to that tradition of ex voto or retablo art, devotional images created for private contemplation rather than public display. The child in the painting stands isolated, her innocence framed by the emptiness of the landscape. The white skull mask links her to Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, a Mexican celebration honoring the dead, not through fear, but remembrance. For Kahlo, who had grown up among such rituals, the mask does not symbolize horror. It represents acceptance, continuity, and the coexistence of life and death. The toy-like tiger mask on the ground may signify protection or instinct, the wild protective spirit that has been set aside. The single yellow flower she holds, delicate and temporary, bridges those two worlds, childhood play and the awareness of mortality. Historically, this work belongs to Kahlo's smaller, introspective pieces painted between her major self-portraits. During this time, she explored themes of solitude, ritual, and identity through symbolism drawn from Mexican folk culture. The composition's simplicity, a single figure against open space, allows every detail to carry meaning. The rough mountains in the distance and the emptiness of the ground emphasize the child's isolation, transforming the scene into a psychological landscape rather than a literal one. A factual note: The painting is signed Frida Kahlo 38 in the lower left corner, confirming its creation in 1938. It was executed in oil on metal, measuring only 38 by 25 centimeters. Kahlo used the smooth surface of the tin to achieve clarity and brightness in the colors, the soft pink of the dress, the muted green of the field, and the stark white of the mask. The child's proportions are slightly distorted, giving her a fragile, almost doll-like quality that reinforces the tension between innocence and awareness. Viewed today, Girl with Death Mask, She Plays Alone, encapsulates Kahlo's philosophy of duality: joy beside sorrow, life beside death, identity beside anonymity. The girl stands not in fear, but in quiet acceptance, embodying a worldview where mortality is woven into daily life. It is a meditation on solitude, culture, and the moment when the child begins to understand what the adult already knows, that to live fully in the world, one must also learn to look calmly at its end. Dante and Virgil. A red, infernal light spreads across the scene. Two men, the poet Dante and his guide Virgil, stand frozen before a vision of rage. In front of them, two naked figures are locked in a desperate struggle. One has his teeth buried in the throat of the other, his muscles strained in a gesture of pure fury. Their bodies shine with a strange, sculptural beauty, even as they twist in violence. The background burns with smoky reds and shadowed forms, suggesting a pit of endless torment. The viewer feels caught between admiration and unease, drawn to the perfection of suffering. William Adolphe Bouguereau painted Dante and Virgil in 1850 at the age of 25. Born in La Rochelle, France in 1825, he became known for his flawless technique, polished surfaces, and mythological serenity, but this early work stands apart from the calm beauty of his later paintings. It was created as his entry for the prestigious Rome Prize, an award that could secure a young artist's future. To prove his mastery, Bouguereau chose one of the most difficult subjects imaginable, a moment of violence and moral tension from Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. The painting depicts a scene from Inferno where Dante and Virgil descend through the 8th circle of hell, the place reserved for falsifiers and deceivers. There they witness two damned souls locked in eternal combat: Gianni Schicchi, who once impersonated another man for greed, and Capocchio, an alchemist condemned for false creation. Bouguereau captures the exact second when Schicchi bites Capocchio's neck, while Dante recoils and Virgil holds him back. The precision of anatomy, the contrasting expressions of horror and control, and the perfect arrangement of forms reveal the artist's complete command of the human body as a vehicle for drama. The meaning goes beyond literature. The two combatants represent more than physical conflict. They show the collapse of reason under passion. Bouguereau contrasts their animalistic frenzy with the stillness of Dante and Virgil, figures of intellect and witness. Light falls across the central bodies like a judgment, exposing every muscle and shadow. The viewer stands where Dante stands, watching punishment that mirrors human nature itself. It is both beautiful and unbearable. A remarkable fact is that despite its ambition, Dante and Virgil did not win the Rome Prize. The judges praised the technical perfection, but criticized the brutality of the subject. For Bouguereau, this rejection became a turning point. He soon moved toward the idealized mythological scenes that would later define his fame: serene goddesses, angels, and figures of purity. Yet beneath their calm surfaces, the tension of Dante and Virgil always remained, like a hidden heartbeat. Today, the painting is kept in the Orsay Museum in Paris, where it appears almost alien among Bouguereau's softer works. Its power lies not in beauty, but in confrontation, the clash between perfection and chaos. It shows an artist at the edge of control, balancing on the border between the sacred and the brutal. Dante and Virgil remains one of the rare paintings where academic mastery and primal instinct meet, an image of eternal struggle rendered with impossible precision. David with the head of Goliath. The scene is dim and quiet. A young man stands against a background of deep shadow, holding a sword in one hand and the severed head of a giant in the other. The light, typical of Caravaggio, cuts across the darkness like revelation, bright on the youth's face, soft on the metal, fading into black. David's expression is not one of triumph, but of sorrowful reflection. His victory seems heavy, not glorious. The head he holds, lifeless, aged, and marked by suffering, is believed to be Caravaggio's own likeness. The painting feels less like a story from scripture and more like a self-portrait in confession. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio painted David with the head of Goliath around 1609 to 1610, near the end of his life. Born in Milan in 1571, he revolutionized art with his dramatic realism and intense contrasts of light and shadow. But by this time, his life had descended into chaos. He lived as a fugitive, accused of murder, and forced to wander through Italy seeking pardon. This painting, created in that period of exile, carries the weight of his personal torment. It is one of his last known works, painted possibly as a plea for forgiveness to the papal court. The biblical episode is one of the oldest symbols of moral victory, the young David defeating the giant Goliath with courage and faith. But Caravaggio transforms the familiar tale into a meditation on guilt and mercy. David does not display the head as a trophy. He looks upon it with empathy, even sadness. The giant's face, with its heavy features and half-open mouth, shows not evil, but exhaustion, as if the true subject were not triumph over sin, but the recognition of it. Many scholars believe Caravaggio identified himself with Goliath, a man destroyed by his own violence, looking to his conqueror as if seeking redemption through death. The symbolism deepens in every detail. David's youth represents purity, conscience, and renewal, the uncorrupted part of the self that confronts the darker half. The sword bears the Latin inscription HAS-OS, interpreted as Humilitas occidit superbium, humility kills pride. The message is personal and moral at once, repentance as the only path to grace. The chiaroscuro technique, light emerging from absolute blackness, turns the story into a spiritual metaphor. The light does not erase the darkness, it simply makes it visible. An intriguing fact is that Caravaggio may have painted the work intending it as a gift for Cardinal Scipione Borghese, whose influence could secure his pardon. The emotional intensity and the use of his own face as Goliath's may have been deliberate, an artist offering himself symbolically to judgment. The plan never succeeded. Caravaggio died shortly after, under uncertain circumstances, before any pardon reached him. Today, David with the head of Goliath is kept in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. It stands as one of the most personal paintings in Western art, not a victory scene, but a confession in paint. Through the merging of violence and tenderness, youth and decay, Caravaggio transformed a biblical legend into a mirror of the human condition. It is the vision of a man who knew both light and darkness and painted them as one. The hands resist him. A young boy stands before a glass door. Beside him is a life-size doll, pale, motionless, with hollow eyes and jointed limbs. Behind the glass, dozens of small hands press outward from the darkness, reaching toward the child. The light inside the room is faint and unnatural, casting long reflections that divide the figures from the world beyond. The setting feels ordinary, a wooden floor, a door, yet something is deeply wrong. The painting seems to exist between waking and dream, where reality begins to unravel quietly. Bill Stoneham created The Hands Resist Him in 1972 while living in California. Born in 1947, Stoneham was a surrealist painter whose work often explored memory, identity, and the space between the familiar and the uncanny. The image was inspired by an old childhood photograph of himself standing in front of a glass door. The doll represents, according to Stoneham, a guide between worlds, the link between the conscious and the subconscious. The hands behind the glass are the forces of the unknown, reaching from dreams into waking life. The context of the painting's fame is unusual. For years, The Hands Resist Him was largely unnoticed, hanging in a Los Angeles gallery before being sold and later forgotten. Decades later, around the year 2000, it resurfaced when the owners auctioned it online, with a description claiming strange occurrences, figures moving, faces changing, and a sense of presence in the room. The listing attracted enormous attention, and the painting became an early internet legend, widely referred to as the haunted eBay painting. Though no verifiable evidence of anything supernatural was ever found, the story transformed Stoneham's work into one of the most recognizable images of modern folklore. Beyond myth, the painting functions as a study of boundaries. The boy, representing the artist's younger self, stands at the threshold between inner and outer worlds, childhood and adulthood, imagination and memory. The doll's unblinking gaze suggests control and protection, but also detachment. The hands pressing against the glass embody the invisible pressures of existence, people, fears, expectations, or lost moments trying to reach through. The painting's flat perspective, muted colors, and photographic composition create a documentary calm that makes the strangeness more believable. A notable fact is that Stoneham painted the work on a door panel, not canvas, giving it a physical link to the barrier it portrays. Years later, he painted several sequels, each exploring what might happen if the door were opened. The boy grown older, the doll transformed, the hands multiplying or fading. He described the entire series not as horror, but as autobiography told through dream logic. Today, The Hands Resist Him stands as both artwork and modern myth. Its power lies not in fear, but in suggestion. The way it captures the unease of standing before something you cannot explain, but somehow recognize. The boy, the doll, the hands, none move, yet the silence feels alive. It is less a haunting than a reminder that memory itself resists, always trying to reach through the glass, asking to be seen. Medusa, A severed head appears frozen in midair. Its mouth opens in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror, and hair transformed into writhing snakes. The skin glistens with lifelike detail, veins, shadows, and drops of what looks like fresh blood at the edge of the neck. The head seems alive at the moment of death, caught between horror and consciousness. The image rests on a circular shield painted with such precision that it reflects light like real bronze. The viewer cannot tell whether the head is an object or a being still capable of seeing. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio painted Medusa around 1597 to 1598 at the height of his fame in Rome. Born in Milan in 1571, Caravaggio had already transformed painting through his radical realism and use of tenebrous light, sharp contrasts of brightness and darkness that brought emotional immediacy to sacred and mythological subjects. Medusa was commissioned as a ceremonial gift for the Grand Duke of Tuscany, symbolizing courage and mastery over fear. Unlike traditional depictions on shields or frescoes, Caravaggio's version was painted on an actual convex wooden surface designed to imitate a warrior's shield. The myth of Medusa had been retold for centuries. Once a beautiful woman, she was transformed by the goddess Athena into a monster whose gaze could turn any living being to stone. When the hero Perseus confronted her, he avoided her deadly stare by viewing her reflection in a polished shield before taking her head. Caravaggio chose the exact instant after that moment, when the head is severed but still aware. Rather than showing Perseus's triumph, he shows Medusa's realization, her final shock and humanity. Symbolically, the work stands at the meeting point of horror and self-recognition. The myth of Medusa is about reflection, literally and psychologically. Some scholars suggest that Caravaggio saw himself in her, condemned by violence, yet immortalized through image. Indeed, the face on the shield bears a striking resemblance to the artist's own. The weapon that defeated the monster becomes a mirror in which the painter's own mortality appears. The result is both self-portrait and myth, an emblem of transformation through art. Technically, Medusa displays Caravaggio's absolute control of realism. The illusion of depth on the curved surface, the precision of the light, and the lifelike rendering of each snake demonstrate his mastery of perspective and anatomy. The convex shape forces the viewer to move, changing the reflection and revealing how light and shadow shift across the head, echoing the myth's theme of sight and danger. A remarkable fact: there are two known versions of Medusa. The first, an earlier experiment, is kept in a private collection. The second, and more famous, known as the Medusa Murtola, is preserved in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It was named after the poet Gaspare Murtola, who wrote of it, "Flee, for if your eyes are petrified in horror, she will turn you to stone." Seen today, Medusa remains one of Caravaggio's most striking creations, not because of its violence, but because of its tension between life and stillness. The gaze no longer belongs to a mythic creature, but to a human being caught at the edge of awareness. In that instant, art replaces the shield. Reflection becomes survival, and the viewer becomes the next to look directly into the eyes of fear. The triumph of death. A vast landscape stretches across the canvas, a world without order or escape. Skeletons flood the scene from every direction, carrying weapons, drums, and banners. Fires burn in the distance. The sea is filled with sinking ships. Gallows and wheels rise against the red horizon. Every part of life, peasants, nobles, soldiers, even lovers, is caught in the same unstoppable wave. Death advances not as a single figure, but as an army. The palette of browns, reds, and dusty gray gives the impression of a dying world where the air itself has turned to ash. Peter Bruegel the Elder painted the triumph of death around 1562 during a century of plague, religious war, and political unrest in Europe. Born in the Netherlands around 1525, Bruegel was known for his panoramic scenes of peasant life and moral allegory, yet this work stands apart in its scale and severity. Instead of a moment or story, it presents an entire vision, a total collapse of civilization seen from above, rendered with almost documentary precision. The painting's context lies in an age obsessed with mortality. Europe had not yet recovered from recurring outbreaks of plague, and the wars of religion had torn through cities and kingdoms. Bruegel's triumph can be read as both reflection and warning, a meditation on the universal reach of fate. Unlike many artists who depicted death as moral punishment, Bruegel shows it as impartial. Kings and beggars, clerics and soldiers all fall under the same rule. His vision is not theological but existential, a study of the order that comes when all human distinctions vanish. Symbolically, the work functions like a map of the end. The skeletons act with mechanical calm, playing music, herding victims, recording names, turning death into bureaucracy. A coffin doubles as a table for soldiers drinking their last wine. A bell tolls with no one left to hear it. In the center, a massive cart filled with skulls moves slowly forward, pushed by the dead themselves. Even time seems to have stopped. There is only motion without direction. The painting captures not horror, but inevitability, a silent equilibrium reached through destruction. An interesting fact, although the triumph of death belongs to the Northern Renaissance, it anticipates the vision of modern apocalypse, panoramic, secular, and psychological. Its detail invites microscopic study: a dog gnawing a skull, a child reaching for a toy, a cardinal stripped of his robes. Scholars believe Bruegel based parts of the composition on earlier medieval dance of death motifs, but expanded them into something entirely new, a total environment of extinction, rather than a moral allegory. Today the painting hangs in the Prado Museum in Madrid. Its power lies not in shock, but in its calm precision, the way Bruegel's steady hand describes annihilation as if it were routine. The triumph of death is less a depiction of terror than a mirror held up to history. It reminds the viewer that the end, in Bruegel's world, is not chaos, but balance, the moment when everything, from the highest tower to the smallest life, returns to the same still silence. Works of H.R. Giger. Across his paintings and sculptures spreads a world built from bone, metal, and dream. Every surface seems alive, tubes become veins, machines breathe, and bodies merge with architecture. There are no borders between flesh and structure. The colors are limited to cold grays, silvers, and muted greens, giving the impression of twilight without sun. The spaces are vast yet claustrophobic, filled with the rhythm of repeating forms: ribs, skulls, pistons, as if life itself had evolved into machinery. Hans Redi Giger was born in Chur, Switzerland in 1940. Trained first as an architect and industrial designer, he turned to art in the 1960s, developing what he called the biomechanical style, the fusion of organic anatomy with mechanical precision. Using airbrush techniques, he created perfectly smooth surfaces that made every nightmare appear real. His early works, such as the Necronom series, drew attention for their visionary depth and their ability to transform subconscious fear into tangible form. Giger's art was not fantasy, but architecture for the human psyche, mechanical, erotic, and coldly beautiful. The broader context of his work emerged during a time of technological optimism and existential anxiety. Post-war Europe was redefining its relationship with progress, science, and the human body. Giger's imagery mirrored that tension, the dream of control turning into fusion, invention becoming dependence. He often described his works as landscapes of the inner mind, places where human beings have already become part of their own creations. His paintings and sculptures offered not prediction, but diagnosis, humanity merging with its tools until neither could survive without the other. Symbolically, Giger's universe explores transformation and identity. His figures, often female, hybrid, or skeletal, embody both creation and decay. The recurring motifs of tunnels, wombs, and engines suggest birth and confinement at once. There is no clear difference between body and environment. Everything is interconnected, functioning like a single organism. In this sense, his work can be read as both a myth of evolution and a metaphor for modern existence, the merging of organic life with artificial structure, emotion with mechanism. A defining moment in his career came in 1979, when director Ridley Scott invited him to design the creature and environments for Alien. Giger's designs, drawn from his Necronom Afur painting, redefined cinematic science fiction. The alien's shape, simultaneously human and inhuman, industrial and organic, became one of the most recognized forms in modern visual culture. The film's success introduced Giger's imagery to the world, but did not limit his creativity. He continued producing paintings, sculptures, and furniture, all bound by the same biomechanical vision. A notable fact: Giger's house in Gruyere, Switzerland, was later transformed into the H.R. Giger Museum, displaying his entire body of work, from early ink drawings to monumental sculptures. Inside, even the architecture reflects his aesthetic: curved walls, skeletal chairs, and arched ceilings that feel like the inside of a living machine. The museum is not merely a gallery, but an environment, extending the logic of his art into physical space. Viewed as a whole, the works of H.R. Giger form one continuous landscape, a portrait of evolution turned inward. His art is not about fear, but about transformation, the realization that technology and humanity are no longer separate. In the silence of his worlds, the boundary between life and mechanism disappears, leaving behind a vision both unsettling and strangely inevitable, a future that feels like memory. The Smiling Spider. A spider fills the frame, enormous, with 8 hairy legs radiating outward like black lines drawn across emptiness. Its round body supports a face that smiles faintly, almost human. The eyes glint with amusement, not menace, and the grin is calm, deliberate, knowing. There is no background, only the pale void of paper surrounding the creature. The result is unnerving, not because it threatens, but because it looks as if it understands something the viewer does not. Odilon Redon created the smiling spider in 1881 as part of his series of charcoal drawings known as noir. Born in Bordeaux, France, in 1840, Redon lived between the rationalism of the 19th century and the emerging world of symbolism and dream. His early life was marked by isolation and illness, and his art often drifted toward the mysterious, images that existed between science and vision, between real anatomy and imagination. By the time he made the smiling spider, he had already abandoned traditional realism to explore the inner world of thought and unease. The context of Redon's work lies in an age fascinated by psychology and natural observation. Scientists were cataloging species and studying the unseen through microscopes, while philosophers were turning inward, studying the human mind. Redon combined these worlds, the scientific eye and the dreaming mind. His creatures, though fantastical, feel carefully observed, as if drawn from life. The spider, one of the most intricate builders in nature, becomes in his hands a symbol of complexity, both creator and predator, artist and monster. Symbolically, the smiling spider embodies ambiguity, the coexistence of attraction and discomfort. The human face gives intelligence to the inhuman, while the spider's body amplifies what is primal and instinctive. Some interpreters see it as a portrait of the artist himself, an isolated being who creates delicate webs in the dark, both admired and feared. The smile, therefore, may not express joy but awareness, the recognition of duality within every living thing. Redon once wrote that his goal was to place the visible at the service of the invisible, and here that idea becomes literal, a creature of the imagination rendered as if alive. An interesting fact, Redon did not intend his noirs to frighten. When critics described his works as disturbing, he replied that they were, to him, humorous, products of curiosity rather than fear. The smiling face, drawn with soft shading and precise lines, shows control rather than chaos. He used charcoal and chalk to create depth without color, achieving a dreamlike balance between clarity and vagueness. In later years, Redon abandoned the dark tones of the noirs for luminous paintings of flowers and mythic figures, yet the smiling spider remains central to his legacy. It represents the moment when modern art began to turn inward, from depicting what is seen to revealing what is felt. The creature smiles because it already knows the truth that Redon wanted to show, that every fear, when looked at closely, contains recognition, the realization that the unknown is part of ourselves. Francis Bacon's Screaming Popes series. A man in papal robes sits enthroned within a transparent cage. His mouth is open wide, caught in a silent scream. The colors pulse between deep purples, acid yellows, and bruised grays, dissolving the form into streaks and vibrations. His body appears both solid and melting, his face both human and distorted. Around him, space collapses. Walls dissolve into vertical lines, turning the throne into a trap. What should be a portrait of authority becomes a vision of confinement, a figure consumed by his own voice. Francis Bacon began the Screaming Popes in the early 1950s, reinterpreting Diego Velázquez's 1650 masterpiece, Portrait of Pope Innocent X. Born in Dublin in 1909 and raised in England, Bacon lived through war, loss, and political turmoil. His work abandoned traditional composition in favor of raw psychological impact. For Bacon, painting was not illustration but exposure, revealing the nervous system of emotion beneath the skin of appearances. The popes became his most haunting subject, repeated obsessively for more than 2 decades. The context of these works reflects a century defined by instability. After the destruction of World War II, institutions, religious, political, and moral, had lost much of their certainty. Bacon took Velázquez's image of supreme authority and stripped it of grandeur. The Pope is no longer a symbol of divine order, but a man isolated in a glass box, overwhelmed by the sound of his own scream. The transparency of the cage and the streaks of paint suggest not imprisonment by others, but by existence itself, the human trapped within consciousness. Symbolically, the series transforms power into vulnerability. Bacon's popes wear the garments of control yet appear weightless, disintegrating under invisible pressure. The scream becomes both release and paralysis, a sound that never escapes. The vertical lines across the canvas resemble curtains or prison bars, dividing the figure from the viewer. Bacon often said he wanted to paint the mouth like Monet painted a sunset, fascinated by how a single expression could contain all human emotion. In his hands, the scream becomes universal, terror, grief, resistance, and revelation all at once. A remarkable detail is Bacon's method. He refused preliminary sketches, working directly on canvas, dragging and smearing the paint with brushes, rags, or his own own hands. His studio in London was a chaos of torn photographs, medical diagrams, and reproductions of Velázquez's portrait, all stained and altered. The popes were not copies, but mutations, evolving from the same image through impulse and chance. Each version differs. Some almost dissolve into abstraction. Others show faces barely human, eyes erased by motion. An interesting fact: Bacon never saw Velázquez's original painting in person. He worked entirely from black and white reproductions, claiming that distance made the image more powerful. This separation between source and creation, tradition and distortion, defines the series itself. It is not a dialogue with religion, but with art history, turning reverence into confrontation. Today, Bacon's screaming popes stand as one of the most recognizable visual expressions of 20th century anxiety. They merge beauty and horror into a single gesture, the cry that never ends. In them, faith, power, and identity collapse into the same silent vibration. The Pope no longer speaks for the divine, he speaks for everyone, caught in the glass box of existence, unable to stop the echo of his own scream. The Cyclops. A giant head rises above a glowing hillside. Its single, enormous eye gazes downward with calm curiosity, not malice. Below, a nude figure, small, delicate, and sleeping, lies on the grass, surrounded by flowers and soft color. The creature's body is barely visible behind the hill, its immense scale suggested by the tilt of the horizon and the curve of its shoulders. The scene feels suspended between tenderness and unease. The Cyclops does not attack. He observes quietly, almost lovingly. Odilon Redon painted the Cyclops around 1898 to 1914, near the end of his career. Born in 1840 in Bordeaux, France, Redon belonged to a generation that bridged Romanticism and modern symbolism. His early works, the noirs, drawn in charcoal and filled with strange, dreamlike creatures, explored darkness and subconscious imagery. But in his later years, color entered his world. The Cyclops belongs to that luminous period, where imagination became radiant rather than shadowed. The painting merges myth with dream, replacing fear with curiosity. The context of the image draws from Greek mythology. The sleeping figure is Galatea, a nymph of the sea, while the Cyclops is Polyphemus, who watches her from afar, secretly in love. In classical myth, Polyphemus is monstrous, violent, and jealous, but Redon transforms him into something different, a being of emotion rather than brutality. His gaze is soft, the colors warm, the composition serene. Instead of tragedy, the scene becomes a vision of longing, distance, and the gentler side of the unknown. Symbolically, the Cyclops reflects Redon's fascination with perception. The single eye becomes a symbol of vision itself, direct, intuitive, unfiltered by logic. It is the gaze of imagination looking at innocence, the unknown contemplating the human. The landscape, filled with golden light and dreamlike hues, suggests a world that belongs more to memory than to nature. Redon once wrote that his goal was to place the logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. Here he achieves that perfectly. Myth becomes metaphor for how the mind sees what cannot be touched. A remarkable detail is the painting's texture. Redon used layered pastels and oils to create a glowing, powdery surface where color seems to float rather than rest. The contrast between the Cyclops' massive head and the delicate figure of Galatea is balanced by harmony of tone, red, blue, and yellow merging into silence. The light does not come from the sun, but from within the landscape itself, as if the world were illuminated by emotion. An interesting fact: the Cyclops was never intended as an illustration of myth. Redon considered the figure a creature of his own imagination, saying that he painted dreams born from reality. The myth of Polyphemus was only a framework for something more intimate, the union of the monstrous and the gentle, the outer world and the inner eye. Today, the Cyclops stands as one of Redon's defining works, a vision of empathy in the language of myth. It reverses expectation. The giant is not the threat, but the witness. In his single, patient eye lies the core of Redon's art, that to look deeply at the unknown is not to fear it, but to understand that it too is capable of tenderness. Head of a guillotined man. A severed head lies on a plain surface, its eyes half closed, its mouth slightly open. The skin is pale, tinged with yellow and gray, while the hair remains dark and tangled. There is no setting, no background, no symbolic detail, only the face, rendered with startling calm and precision. The light falls softly, almost tenderly, across the features. The image feels neither grotesque nor sensational. Instead, it is quiet, clinical, and strangely human. Théodore Géricault created Head of a Guillotined Man around 1818 to 1819. During the same years, he worked on his monumental Raft of the Medusa. Born in France in 1791, Géricault stood at the threshold between classicism and romanticism, a generation torn between rational order and emotional truth. His interest in anatomy, mortality, and psychological intensity led him to subjects that many artists avoided. This study of a decapitated head was not a painting of myth or history, but of raw observation, an attempt to face reality without mediation. The context of its creation is deeply connected to Géricault's preparation for the Raft of the Medusa. To understand the effects of death on the human body, he visited hospitals and morgues, sketching corpses and dissected remains. He obtained permission to study freshly executed criminals, examining the weight of flesh, the color of decay, and the forms that persist beyond life. These anatomical studies were never intended for public display. They were exercises in honesty, a pursuit of truth through direct vision. Symbolically, Head of a Guillotined Man is more than a study in anatomy. It represents the romantic fascination with the line between life and death, that fragile instant when individuality vanishes but form remains. The calmness of the face suggests sleep, yet the absence of breath reveals the finality of matter. The painting refuses to moralize or dramatize. It simply shows. In that neutrality lies its power. Géricault transforms what could be macabre into something introspective, a meditation on the human condition stripped of narrative or judgment. A striking fact, Géricault's contemporaries found these works disturbing, and most were never exhibited in his lifetime. They were discovered only later among his private studies, yet their influence quietly shaped later art, especially among painters who sought realism without sentiment. From Courbet to the early modernists, the unflinching observation of the human body, seen here, became a foundation for the psychological realism that defined 19th century painting. Today, Head of a Guillotined Man survives as one of Géricault's most unsettling and honest works. It stands outside religion, politics, and allegory, a single human presence reduced to its final form, yet still carrying the trace of individuality. In its silence, the painting confronts what art usually hides, that death is not an event, but a transformation of perception. Through this fragment of flesh, Géricault invites the viewer to look, not in horror, but in recognition, at what remains when everything else has been stripped away. The Fall of the Damned. The painting opens into chaos. Figures tumble through a storm of fire and darkness, their bodies twisted as they fall into a vast pit below. Some reach upward, others cover their faces, while monstrous forms rise to meet them. Creatures made of flame, smoke, and distorted anatomy. The space has no horizon, no solid ground, only the endless descent of forms vanishing into shadow. The light burns from below, illuminating flesh and terror with the color of molten gold. It is a vision of gravity without end, a world collapsing inward. Dirk Boutz, born in Haarlem around 1415, painted The Fall of the Damned in the late 15th century during the height of the Northern Renaissance. He worked mostly in Leuven, where he became known for his precise detail, cool color palette, and serene religious scenes. But this work, often regarded as part of a larger Last Judgment altarpiece, departs from calm devotion. Here, theology becomes vision, an image of divine justice rendered with the cold precision of a document. The context behind Boutz's painting reflects the late medieval obsession with salvation and fear. Europe was still marked by famine, plague, and social upheaval. The church emphasized moral order and the terrifying consequences of sin. Artists like Boutz, Jan van Eyck, and Rogier van der Weyden transformed these ideas into images of perfect clarity and control. In The Fall of the Damned, that control becomes paradoxical. Every figure is painted with care, yet the total effect is overwhelming disorder. It is a moral landscape built from chaos. Symbolically, the work embodies the concept of divine symmetry. In medieval theology, heaven and hell mirror each other, one rising, one falling, each the necessary balance of justice. Boutz divides his figures between order and collapse. The saved ascend in calm harmony in the companion panel, while the damned spiral into confusion. The vertical descent becomes both physical and moral, the loss of grace visualized as downward motion. Even the demons, shaped with human anatomy, echo the sins they punish, suggesting that evil is not external but human magnified. A revealing fact, Boutz was among the first artists in Northern Europe to use linear perspective systematically, a technique he adapted from Italian masters. In The Fall of the Damned, he twists that system. The lines of perspective no longer converge toward peace or stability, but toward the abyss itself. The viewer's eye is pulled downward, trapped in the same gravitational pull as the figures. The geometry of salvation becomes the geometry of ruin. Today, The Fall of the Damned survives as both moral allegory and psychological study. Its precision, instead of comforting, amplifies dread. The clearer the forms, the the deeper the uncertainty. Bouts does not depict chaos through brushwork or color, but through logic, a perfectly organized descent. In that order lies the true horror, a vision of punishment so structured that even despair obeys its own symmetry. The result is one of the earliest visual meditations on existential collapse, the moment when reason itself follows the soul into the void. The night. The scene unfolds inside a small, twisted room. The walls lean inward, the light is harsh, and every figure seems trapped within the frame. In the center, a man is bound by the arms, while another figure pulls his head backward. A woman hangs upside down from the ceiling, her face obscured, while in the background, another woman clings to a child. The bodies are distorted but heavy with realism, painted with thick, angular strokes that make the space feel both physical and claustrophobic. The atmosphere is one of suffocation, as if air itself has been removed. Max Beckmann painted The Night in 1918-19, immediately after the end of the First World War. Born in Leipzig, Germany in 1884, Beckmann had served as a medical orderly during the conflict and witnessed the aftermath of violence firsthand. When he returned to painting, his style had changed completely. He abandoned classical harmony for sharp outlines, compressed space, and emotional intensity. The Night became his response not only to war, but to the collapse of meaning that followed it, a visual record of the human psyche after catastrophe. The context behind the painting reflects the political and social disintegration of post-war Germany. The empire had fallen, poverty and unrest spread across cities, and the promises of modernity had dissolved into disillusionment. Beckmann's interior is not a literal scene, but a metaphor for that world, a microcosm of cruelty, helplessness, and disorientation. The figures act without identity or purpose, as if caught in an endless ritual of aggression and despair. The title, The Night, suggests both the physical darkness of the room and the moral darkness of the age. Symbolically, the work stands as one of the earliest expressions of what would later be called New Objectivity, a style that replaced idealism with blunt psychological truth. The violence is not heroic or historical. It is intimate. Each gesture feels mechanical, stripped of emotion. The room functions as both prison and stage, a closed system where suffering repeats endlessly. Beckmann's thick black outlines and distorted perspective amplify that tension. Every object is solid, yet the space feels unstable, as if collapsing under invisible pressure. An important fact, Beckmann did not consider The Night a direct depiction of any event. He saw it as an image of the disintegration of values. The figures, the man, the women, the child, were symbols of humanity itself, suspended between instinct and morality. Over time, critics interpreted the scene as a universal vision of torment, foreshadowing the political violence that would soon dominate Europe again. The painting's rough texture and sharp color contrast, ochres, blacks, and flashes of blue, give it the weight of physical memory, like a wound that refuses to close. Today, The Night remains one of the defining images of modern existential painting. It rejects beauty as comfort and replaces it with clarity, an unflinching view of chaos within the human world. In its compressed room, every element becomes a mirror of what Beckmann had witnessed. Civilization turned inward, trapped with itself, unable to awaken. The result is not despair, but understanding, the recognition that darkness, once revealed, can no longer be hidden. Man proposes, God disposes. At first glance, the scene seems like a moment frozen after disaster. Two polar bears occupy a desolate Arctic landscape. Around them, fragments of a shattered expedition lie scattered, a broken mast, torn fabric, and the pale bones of human remains half buried in snow. One bear gnaws on a piece of wood that still bears traces of red paint. The other tears into what was once a flag. The sky above is heavy and colorless, an unending horizon of ice. The composition is quiet but merciless, a vision of nature reclaiming what ambition left behind. Sir Edwin Landseer painted Man Proposes, God Disposes in 1864 at the height of his career as one of Britain's most celebrated animal painters. Born in London in 1802, Landseer was admired for his technical precision and his ability to convey emotion through animals, pride, fear, loyalty, or grief. Yet this painting stands apart from his sentimental works. Commissioned by the collector Thomas Holloway, it was inspired by the disappearance of Sir John Franklin's Arctic expedition of 1845, whose remains were discovered years later, revealing the tragic fate of the crew. Landseer transformed that historical event into an allegory of power, pride, and the futility of human control over nature. The title itself, Man Proposes, God Disposes, comes from an old proverb meaning that human plans are insignificant beside the will of fate. In the painting, Landseer abandons moral explanation and replaces it with imagery of natural order. The bears are not villains, they are extensions of the environment, acting according to their instincts. The objects left behind, a telescope, fragments of a ship, and bones, are the relics of human ambition reduced to debris. Through the calm realism of the brushwork, Landseer communicates not horror, but inevitability. Symbolically, the work reflects Victorian anxiety about progress and exploration. In an era that celebrated empire and science, the painting offers a counter-image, nature as indifferent, vast, and eternal. The Arctic becomes both a real place and a metaphor for the limits of human understanding. The bears, painted with almost human intelligence in their eyes, function as witnesses, survivors of an event that transcends human tragedy. Their presence transforms the landscape into a moral theater of silence. A fascinating fact. For decades, the painting hung in the Royal Holloway College in London, where it gained a reputation for unsettling students. During examinations held in the hall where it was displayed, a tradition developed of covering the painting with a Union Jack flag, a gesture born from superstition that its gaze brought bad luck or madness. The myth surrounding it only deepened its aura of quiet menace, merging historical memory with folklore. Today, Man Proposes, God Disposes remains one of the most haunting images of the 19th century. It is not a story of cruelty, but of balance, the world returning to its own rhythm after the noise of human ambition. Through perfect realism and absolute restraint, Landseer captured the moment when all civilization, invention, and pride dissolve back into the landscape that was always waiting. The Arctic in his painting is not empty, it is eternal, a mirror of the silence that follows when humanity falls still.